Most recessions are caused by what we call demand shocks, an unexpected change in aggregate demand. That could come from consumers, right? They could become more pessimistic. They could have a change in their wealth, and so they want to save more and spend less. It could come from business, where businesses don't want to invest as much. It could come from government, where government has to spend less for some reason. Or it could come from overseas where people stop buying a lot of our exports and aggregate demand falls for that reason. So, what we want to talk about now is how governments respond to those demand shocks and uh, especially with a focus on monetary policy, right? Now, we can use both fiscal policy and monetary policy to stabilize the economy, but most economists generally feel that monetary policy is preferable, both because it's usually well targeted and because it's faster and less political. That said, sometimes monetary policy runs out of bullets, like it did in the last recession when it got to the zero lower bound, and fiscal policy really needs to step in. So, a lot of central banks use what's called inflation targeting, meaning that they try to target a very specific inflation rate, usually something around 2%, sometimes it's 2.5%, in order to keep the economy at uh, a stable inflation rate and a stable unemployment rate. And a lot of the focus for central banks is about its credibility, right? Because we saw before that the Phillips curve says that if the central bank keeps trying to keep unemployment lower, right, say at 4% instead of 6% or 3% instead of 5%, then inflation can spiral upwards. And if inflation starts spiraling upwards, then nobody's going to believe that the central bank is interested in controlling inflation. And that's one of the reasons that while some economists think that an inflation target of 3% or 4% would be better than 2%, a lot of central banks are very unwilling to increase their inflation target because they worry about losing their credibility. So remember that we can model our central bank's preferences with these sort of target-like um, preference indifference curves. So they want to be at some point like X, right? And that would mean that we have low inflation and reasonably low unemployment. If we're at a point C because of the Phillips curve, right, where inflation is 4% and we get a negative demand shock, right? So, for instance, there could be a fall in investment and we move to point D on the Phillips curve where inflation is lower but the unemployment rate is higher. Remember that the unemployment rate is moving from the right to the left and increasing because we have employment on the horizontal axis. So if that's the case, then the goal is to reduce the interest rate, try to increase investment back up to where it was, and hopefully increase government spending, right? Now, that could be through automatic stabilizers, things like the unemployment benefits, or through reduced taxes, or it could be through new fiscal policy. And hopefully, if that's successful, that gets us back to where we were before. As we saw from the Great Recession, it didn't really work, right? The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was a big stimulus package, took a long time to get put in place and probably helped a little bit. Maybe it's caused the unemployment rate to only go up to 10% instead of 12%, but it didn't help a lot. We certainly didn't get right back to point C like we would like to in this graph. So remember that we have some stable level of inflation that's related to equilibrium in the labor market, right? So they have it graphed here at U equals 6%. In the United States, that's probably something more like 4 or 4.5% unemployment rate. The unemployment rate right now is 4.4%, up from 4.3% last month, and inflation is still pretty low. So we don't think that we are to the right of X in this case in the United States. I think we're pretty close there. Um, if the central bank is successful in uh, targeting its 2% interest rate, then the idea is that they'll be successful in getting to the labor market equilibrium. Of course, this is a big problem in a country, in an area like Europe, with multiple countries that have multiple labor markets, and you might have some labor markets that are very close to point X, and some labor markets that have much, much higher unemployment. And that's been a big problem there.